Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Melissa. I'm the Director of Marketing at DipJar, and we are thrilled to partner with Double the Donation today on this webinar for understanding corporate philanthropy. Just going to give another minute or two to let some more people trickle in, and then we will go ahead and get started.
While everyone's trickling in, this is Sydney Faye with Double D the Nation. Excited to chat with you guys today about the basics of corporate philanthropy and answer some questions. And feel free to take a look at the DipJar brochure as well as our ultimate guide to matching gifts that are located in the handout sections today.
All right, well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Just to kick this off, I just wanted to let you know that throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop any questions, comments, or anything else into that chat, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation to make sure that we are answering any questions you might have. We'll either get to those questions while Sydney Faye is presenting, but we will also take a pause at the end of the webinar to answer any of the questions that we may have missed.
Awesome. We can go ahead and jump in and get started. I think we sent out a poll at the beginning of the webinar, just kind of trying to get an idea of how many of you guys are experienced or practicing some form of corporate philanthropy fundraising at your nonprofit right now. And I think a lot of you guys, are interested in hearing all about corporate philanthropy and maybe, taking some initiative to get started, which is really exciting. So again, I'm Sydney Faye. I am a sales manager at Double D the Nation. And if you've heard of DTD, you've probably maybe hopped on a webinar or something in the past and may have heard my voice or seen my headshot floating around before. So excited to spend the next, 45 minutes to an hour or so chatting with you guys. So like I said, I'm Sydney Faye. I'm a manager. I work with tons of nonprofits to help them really learn more about how they can better manage corporate philanthropy, specifically matching gifts and volunteer grants. DTD, we are Atlanta based. If you've ever been to Atlanta, we're right on the Beltline. So really close to the restaurant Lady Bird, if that's familiar to you guys. We were started about 10 years ago by our president, Adam Weinger, who worked for a big bank, who was match eligible, gave to lots of local nonprofits like his alma mater, Emory, and never really submitted his matching gift request form or volunteer grant forms or participated in corporate philanthropy because he didn't know much about it. So as a result, he quit his job, traveled around the country, spreading the word about matching gifts and corporate philanthropy to nonprofits, and here we are today. A little bit more about DTD very quickly. So if you're familiar with us, we really specialize in matching gifts and volunteer grants. We have the world's largest database with over 23,000 entries in it. We've helped identify over 200 million match eligible dollars specifically for nonprofits. We have over 4,000 clients, partner with tons of different platforms, actually 65 plus now. And we have a client success team that's always available to our clients to offer tips and tricks. Today, really because we're kind of going to get our toes wet in corporate philanthropy, we're not going to do a deep dive into all different types, but we will cover the 5 most common types of corporate philanthropy and then focus on matching gifts and volunteer grants specifically because those are the types of corporate philanthropy that nonprofits tend to have the most control over driving revenue into you guys for. So feel free to kind of ask questions along the way. To dive in, to kind of start at the basics on what is corporate philanthropy. So all of you guys are probably pretty familiar with corporations taking the time to actually support their local community nonprofits or kind of spread initiatives amongst the community to make sure nonprofits and the people you guys are supporting are getting the resources that they need. Typically, corporations have kind of taken that standpoint of supporting nonprofits who are already doing the work, then rolling out some of their own programs, just because, it allows them to be involved in the community. Typically through corporate philanthropy, they get a tax break themselves. And even when it's related specifically to the employees at their corporations, they can kind of help support the missions that their employees believe in as well. So there's a pretty big amount of money that goes towards corporate philanthropy each year from all different types of corporations. When you think about the 5 different types of corporate philanthropy, there's volunteer support, there's employee grant stipends, community grants, which you guys are all probably familiar with community grants, volunteer grants, and matching gifts. So these are really the most common 5 ways that corporations kind of give back to their community. And we'll take a few minutes just to talk about each one of these. And then, like I said, focus a little bit more on matching gifts and volunteer grants. So volunteer support is often sometimes confused with volunteer grants, and that it sounds really similar, but they're actually 2 completely different programs. So these programs partner employees with specific nonprofits to provide specialized volunteer support. So that usually means some sort of like skilled consulting or services, like tax services, or special items like computers are provided to those nonprofits. These types of programs are becoming more and more popular every year. They're really skill-based, really focused on skill-based volunteering. And as more of these programs continue to grow since 2015, there's more companies that are getting involved with providing those skill-based volunteer services. So, sometimes IBM is a good example. They're in the tech space. They help out, especially in the higher ed space, of providing machinery or, software and sending folks out to the students or people in courses, showing them how to use it. That would be a really good example. Typically, there's a speculation that 68% of nonprofit professionals don't actually have the resources they need to do their work. And that's not due to a lack of knowledge or a lack of the ability to do the work. It's more so because you guys probably know everyone's wearing 27 hats in the nonprofit world. So that's where volunteer support continues to grow, as that these corporations are sending out their employees who are skilled in different areas to kind of take some of those hats off of the nonprofit professionals' heads to make sure that you guys can still, reach your missions at the end of the day. So if you're looking for volunteer support, these programs are typically offered through strategic partnerships between corporations and nonprofits. So like I said, IBM is providing support to, engineering schools, would be a good example. So if your mission is very specialized or very specific, and there's a corporation in your area that may have very specific services they can offer, it's always worth thinking about, volunteer support as it relates to your corporate philanthropy person, and kind of, maybe chiming in a couple ideas to see if some of your corporate partners have resources they can offer you guys in addition to money or anything like that. We also have employee grant stipends. So these are becoming more popular as well, but typically through these programs, they're a little bit less common than matching gifts and volunteer grants. A lot of employees don't know about the stipend programs, or they're not widely marketed, but they're excellent programs to take advantage of if you discover that some of your donors' employees do offer them. Some companies will award these grants outright to employees, who then have the option to pass the grants to the nonprofits of their choice. So it goes back in line with corporations wanting to match the philanthropy or the mission-related causes that their employees show interest in. All the employees really have to do is, if the company offers these programs, is fill out paperwork explaining, why the nonprofit they choose deserves the funding. And then typically how it works is these programs are opened up maybe once or twice over the course of a year. So they're not, year long, but then the company rather may take a look at all the different nonprofits that the employees kind of voice their interest in supporting. And they may choose a few or all the nonprofits to approve those grants to be rewarded to. The really cool thing is that this program is employee initiated, similar to volunteer grants and matching gifts, and that the company sets the general infrastructure and the guidelines on what employees can and cannot do, but they get to decide if they participate, and they get to kind of show the nonprofits that they care about, that they do want their employer to also provide them financial support, which is really cool. Like I said, it's super rare that companies are offering employee grant stipend programs right now. But if you do find out a company offers employee grant stipend, it's really important that you guys are marketing those opportunities to those donors who work for that company. And this is another example of a really partner specific program that you can create amongst your existing corporate partners. Or if you are a nonprofit who likes to have, like what I call backyard or neighbor donors, people in your area, maybe you're a really community-based nonprofit, not getting donations from all across the country, you might have a better chance in leveraging these employee grant stipends by reaching out to some of the larger companies in your area as well that may also be, small family-owned or small businesses. Moving on to talk about community grants. Community grants are probably by far the most leveraged type of corporate philanthropy. There's lots of revenue left on the table for other types of corporate philanthropy, whereas community grants, typically, as a nonprofit, as you grow, one of the first roles or first folks you might try to hire is someone who's over grant applications or managing grants or making sure grant dollars are used appropriately. Typically, nonprofits are the one who initiate the process to get community grants, as there may be some type of application process from a foundation or from a corporation to where they kind of lay out some guidelines on who they're looking to support, and you as a nonprofit are initiating that process, maybe writing one of those applications, one of those essays for the applications, and kind of making your case on why you would like to receive a grant and then how you plan to use those dollars. Community grants are super popular, again, because they're easier to find, especially because you as a nonprofit are initiating the process. And outside of you guys, making sure you meet the mission-related services that the corporation wants to offer, there's not tons of other, outside work that needs to go in besides the application process. So all of you guys are probably super familiar with community grants. And then, we'll get to volunteer and matching gift grants, which is where, our focus is going to shift. Again, volunteer grants and matching gift grants are really what Double Donation specializes in. And that's because, there's $4 to $7 billion in matching gift and volunteer gift revenue left on the table each year. So these two areas of corporate philanthropy are growing, becoming more popular every single year. And there's more revenue being left on the table every single year, because as nonprofits, you guys have the ability to kind of take several actions to drive in the most revenue from these programs. But, typically matching gifts and volunteer grants live on the back burner. So it's our goal to, just bring you some knowledge, and you guys can leverage that matching gift guide to kind of figure out different ways you guys can get more of that matching revenue. But volunteer grants, you guys are all pretty familiar. They can be super important and super valuable to nonprofits who obviously have tons of volunteers. So whether you're peer-to-peer, whether you're a nonprofit that, enlists volunteers to go sit with babies in the NICU, or enlist volunteers to go provide supports to people in nursing homes or assisted living homes, if you have tons of volunteers and you rely on volunteers to get your programs and mission-related services completed, like a food bank, I definitely recommend you taking a look into what volunteer grants you guys might be leaving on the table. But really what they are, when companies offer volunteer grants, they're really rewarding their employee a financial contribution to your nonprofit for the hours that employee kind of dedicates in volunteerism. There's typically like a threshold, and we'll get deeper into the thresholds. There's like a minimum and maximum that folks have to volunteer with you. It's typically somewhere maybe like 10 to 20 hours. But based on you as a nonprofit tracking those volunteer hours and encouraging those volunteers to understand if they're eligible, you guys can essentially get a check in the mail just for people showing out and coming out and supporting your nonprofit, which is really cool. About 40% of Fortune 500 companies actually offer volunteer grant programs, which is a huge amount when you think about how much the Fortune 500 companies represent of Americans' workforce. That's tons, that's millions of people who are eligible for volunteer grant programs. And team volunteering is particularly popular, and that I'm sure you guys have seen before. There's a team of folks who may come from one corporation who are volunteering or showing up on a certain day to help clean up the city. And those types of volunteering account for about 70% of the volunteer grant programs. So it's really cool programs. We'll get deeper into how you guys can maybe do a better job at leveraging volunteer grants. But as a volunteer myself, I think it's super important that I'm aware if my company will match the hours I am kind of giving to the nonprofits I care about. Matching gifts, the fifth type of corporate philanthropy that's by far, one of the most popular as far as being offered widely by corporations, but also one of the most underused. Matching gifts, really account for a large number of the revenue being left on the table each year that's being unclaimed by nonprofits. Over half of the Fortune 500 companies offer a matching gift program, and even with the impacts of COVID-19 on specifically the American workforce, lots of companies actually increased the ways they are sponsoring and providing corporate matching gifts by increasing their minimums, increasing their match amounts, and broadening their programs. So there's tons of different matching gift programs that exist. And there's a minimum $2 billion that pass through corporate matching programs each year. But like I said, nothing compared to the 4 to 7 that's being left on the table. Now that we've kind of gone through an overview of some general, corporate philanthropy programs, hope you guys are taking note of some of those that may be of interest to you, especially the ones we won't dive in today. But let's go ahead and get started on volunteer grants. Let's talk more about that. Feel free to post some questions, and then we'll get into matching gifts as well a little bit later. So like I said, volunteer grants are super cool. I'm always excited when I can volunteer because my company DTD, obviously we should have a corporate matching program and a volunteer program, which we do. There's all different types of components to volunteer grants, and understanding those program components are really the first start to understanding, how volunteer grants can impact your nonprofit. So there's tons of paperwork that's involved in volunteer grants and matching gifts, but the good thing it's not, online, it's not offline paperwork anymore. A lot of it's an online process. And because a lot of it's online now through portals like CyberGrant, that might sound familiar to a lot of you guys, the eligibility requirements and all the components are really widely available. So the first thing to consider when you think about nonprofit eligibility is that depending on the type of nonprofit you are, you might not be eligible for every single type of volunteer grant program that exists. So, sometimes if you're a religious organization, maybe your church, or fundraise specifically from ministries to reallocate those dollars back to church-related programs, or if you're a political organization, maybe not a 501c13 but a 501c14. Sometimes those volunteer hours aren't eligible to be matched or to be to get a grant from corporations. That's just how the corporations have chosen to kind of outline those guidelines. So it's important that as you look into volunteer grants and as you may leverage like a volunteer database or matching gift database like DTD offers, that you're keeping an eye on what corporate programs you are eligible for based on your nonprofit type. Typically, when we think about all the different programs, schools K through 12 and like universities and colleges are going to be eligible for over 90% of the existing corporate matching programs. So they're in that broader category of, there being very few to none corporate programs that they're not eligible for. And then, like I said, religious and political organizations are going to be on that lower end, eligible for significantly less. Once you've figured out if you're eligible or not, another component of the programs are going to be the grant amounts. So really figuring out how much revenue can you actually drive in from these different programs. There's often, some type of min or max. The average, $100 to $2,000. max or minimum that a nonprofit can receive for an individual employee who volunteers. So if you have tons of volunteer opportunities over the course of the year, and you guys are doing a good job at tracking those volunteer hours, someone could volunteer, 100 hours with you over the course of the year easily, and that means you guys can get a $2,000 grant from their corporation just because they came out and showed support. So being aware of those different grant amounts can be super important as well, especially as you start to strategically think about which volunteer grant programs you may want to focus on. Employee eligibility is another piece that's very similar to nonprofit eligibility, and that some corporations are saying, we're not going to match our part-time employees' volunteer hours, but we will do full-time or retiree, or vice versa. Some only match full-time, some will match all three, retiree, part-time, and full-time. It's really up to that specific corporation. And then sometimes those minimum hours required can shift depending on employee eligibility. But typically, there's always going to be a minimum amount of hours that is required before an employee is even eligible for a volunteer grant program. And the most average minimum hour amount is 10 hours. And that's 10 hours over the course of a calendar year. So like I said, if you guys are really rooted in volunteerism, that might not be a big hurdle for you guys to jump at all, especially if you have students or retirees or anyone else showing their support to you guys. The fifth component, which is often a really, really important component, especially as we get close to giving season and year end, is the program deadlines rather. Every single company has a deadline on when an employee can submit a volunteer grant application. That's often the end of the year. So, if someone's volunteering with you January to December, a lot of programs are saying, well, you have until December to submit all of your volunteer hours so you guys can get those volunteer grants from your company. So keeping those program deadlines in mind is really important. The same way you guys keep like Giving Tuesday and year-end giving in mind. Being able to think about how you're going to also encourage your volunteers to take advantage of those programs in the final couple months that they have to as well. When we think about the mechanics of matching gifts and mechanics of volunteer grants, it's all pretty similar. And that, like I mentioned, a lot of the programs are online now. So step one, your donor would volunteer. Step two, your donor would submit a volunteer grant request to their employer, which is like an online portal. Step three, the company that they work for would likely approve that the request will go through, or they'll reach out to you as a nonprofit and ask that you approve that they actually volunteered with you. And step four, the company will actually issue a check. It's a relatively simple process once the donor actually, the volunteer donor actually submits that request, but the hard part can be getting them to that point that they actually submit. The reason why there's so much revenue left on the table is because, like I said, the hard part is actually getting volunteers to the point where they do want to actually submit those requests and they understand that they're eligible. Like I said, 40+% of Fortune 500 companies offer volunteer grant information, but we estimate that over 80% of volunteers actually have no clue to if they're eligible or not, or if their company even offers a volunteer grant program. And that's because when you guys start a job, when I start a job, or anyone, you get all these benefits packages normally, and you're most interested in like health insurance and dental and vision and your PTO, right? And then somewhere on page 102 of these Fortune 500 companies welcome packets, it talks about volunteer grants or matching gifts. So a lot of folks just don't even know they're eligible. They don't even know volunteer grants exist. And we estimate that less than 5% of folks who are actually eligible for volunteer grant programs end up submitting a request. So there's just tons of people who are volunteering annually and supporting nonprofits who just never even think to think if they're eligible to get their volunteer hours matched to you guys. The really cool thing is, as the population starts to shift, as people grow older and different generations start to shift in size, there's an assumption that baby boomers are going to start volunteering less and start giving more financially. But right now, about 30% of baby boomers are volunteering. And as millennials specifically, continue to get older, there's some research that shows that millennials are volunteering more than the previous generations, whereas millennials might be giving a little less financially. So there's some opportunities to really speak to different crowds to kind of leverage those volunteer opportunities as well. Feel free to just drop questions along the way. It doesn't look like there's any questions now, so I'm going to go ahead and then we'll talk about kind of same thing, overview of matching gifts, and then we'll move into talking about some different strategies for leveraging both opportunities. So hopefully all of you guys have heard about matching gifts. If I had to guess, matching gifts and volunteer grants, like I said, kind of live on that back burner, and it makes sense. I have a background in university fundraising, and if you ask me where, if I had to split my time, where it would go, 100% of it's going to go on getting the actual fundraising dollars in the door, because you have to fundraise before you're even eligible for matching gifts, and that tends to be the same approach that a lot of nonprofits take, and that a lot of the time goes on driving those gifts in the door, and volunteer grants and matching gifts kind of come in, stroll in as they may, or in more of low-hanging fruit that you might catch some every now and then. But as far as matching gift programs, the components can be broken down into really similar categories, and that the exact same idea of nonprofit eligibility exists, and that as a nonprofit, you are going to be eligible for a certain percentage of corporate matching programs based on your type and your mission. So again, same thing, K through 12 schools are in large eligible for more corporate matching programs. And then, your religious and political nonprofits are on the lower end, eligible for the least amount of corporate matching. And then everyone else, food banks, health and human service organizations, research foundations are kind of in the middle, and that 70 to 80% range of eligibility. From a match ratio standpoint, similarly to how volunteer grants have a certain amount that they will grant out, between that 100 to 2,000 number, matching gifts have a match ratio, which represents the amount that a company will match. Typically, it's 1-to-1, meaning, Tom gives you 50 bucks, Coca-Cola is going to give you $50 more. But about 5% or so of the corporate programs out there will match at a higher rate. So 2-to-1, 3-to-1. We've even seen 5-to-1 for some corporations, meaning donor gives you 100 bucks, the corporation will give 500, which is really cool. And then a very tiny percentage give under 1-to-1. So maybe like they'll give $25 if someone gives 50. But the ratio is super important in that depending on the area you're located, you may be able to tap into some of those companies that may provide higher ratios and be able to leverage those relationships as well. Same thing around employee eligibility. Companies are going to decide if they want part-time, full-time, or retiree donors to be eligible. And based on that employment, there may be higher match amounts or lower match amounts depending on the role at that company. But typically when we think about the gift amount that a company will offer, there's a min and max. And some companies, the only thing a donor has to give is $1 and the company will match the gift. Microsoft is a good example of that. Their minimum is $1. The average companies, the minimum is about $25 that someone has to give. That's about 93% of the companies. They require at least a $25 gift before they match. And then there's maximums can range all over the place. So maximums can be anywhere from $500, which is the most that a corporation will match for an individual employee over the course of a calendar year, but all the way up to $25,000 or more. Some companies are matching very high gifts. And the really important thing to think about for those mins and maximums is that that is not $25,000 per nonprofit that an employee can get matched. That's like $25,000 overall. So imagine having like a pool of money, and the average donor is volunteering and financially supporting, a number of nonprofits. all nonprofits are competing for that same $25,000. So that's a really important piece I like to drive in, and that you really want to be the nonprofit who makes matching gifts as easiest and volunteer grants as easiest to access for your donors, because you'll likely be, the ones they consider, getting those gifts matched to as a result. In the same way, volunteer grants have corporate program deadlines, matching gifts as well, often the end of the calendar year. The idea is that, you really don't want a donor who gave in 2015 reaching out to try to get, that gift matched in 2022. You really want to put some urgency behind those donors participating in those volunteer or giving programs. So pretty similar program guidelines. Typically, these programs are managed by the same folks at the company or by the same application processes. So the steps look a lot similar as well. The donor is going to give to you. They'll submit a matching gift request form. Step 2 is often the part that results in matching gifts never getting to the company, that folks don't know how to submit. Step 3, you might approve, or you might verify the donor gave, or the company might approve the gift. And then the company eventually is going to issue a check to you guys, or like an ACH to your nonprofit. So pretty similar processes. Like I said, the biggest thing is just step 2 for both corporate matching and volunteer grants, and that donors and volunteers just aren't submitting because they're just unaware of their eligibility. Considering over 60% of Fortune 500 companies offer corporate matching gift programs, like I said, that represents millions of eligible donors. It's our belief, because our database is so large, over 23,000 companies that offer volunteer grants and corporate matching, we believe that represents over 26 million individuals who are eligible for those programs. Are all of them giving? No, unfortunately, but a large percentage of those folks are giving, which is crazy, because when you think about where that $4 to $7 billion is being left on the table, it's because, almost 80% of donors just don't know how to submit. They don't know where to submit, how. They feel overwhelmed by the process, or they forget. And that's why nonprofits play such an important role in kind of pushing your donors and volunteers to the point to where they can submit those volunteer grant and matching gift request forms. The biggest gap by far between both all corporate philanthropy programs are going to be donor awareness, but specifically for volunteer grants and matching gifts, because the process is initiated by donors, they have to obviously know about it. And if they don't, that's how money is left on the table each year. Before I go on, I think we have a question. The question is there a way to leverage those gifts when we don't utilize traditional volunteers? I'm guessing this is specifically around volunteer grants. I would be curious to learn a little bit more about what you mean by traditional volunteers, but typically, what you need to do to leverage volunteer grants is have people who you identify as volunteers show up to participate in some type of program or mission related services. Like I said, it could be handing out school lunches, it could be tutoring, it could be someone coming in and filing paperwork on the weekends for you guys. And you need to be able to track those hours. So then that donor will be able to report the number of hours back to their employer that they volunteer with you guys, so you guys can get that revenue. Feel free to provide some more context on, the types of volunteer you guys have, and I'm more than happy to provide some additional insight into that question. But moving on to talk about ways you can actually overcome, this idea of underutilization and this idea that there's billions of dollars left on the table each year from corporate and volunteer matching. The reason why I really like matching gifts and volunteer grants, I mentioned I have a fundraising background. A long time ago, I was in annual giving. I managed a student phonathon program. I managed, a student philanthropy council that students went around and encouraged folks to get involved and give. And all of those different types of fundraising that I did were really driven through people caring about the mission, people caring about the university, especially if any of you guys have had experience with like Telefund, student philanthropy. No one's given if they didn't have a good experience and they don't care about what that university is giving back to students. And the reason why I like matching gift and volunteer grants so much is that people have already bought into your mission. People have already shown you they believe in what you're doing. People have already shown you that they're going to come out and they're going to help you through volunteerism, and they're going to help you with an event. People have shown you that they believe in you because they're giving monthly, or they're just making a gift to you guys for direct response. And that's so exciting because the hard work's really done. People have bought into your mission. Now we just need to make sure those people understand that they can further the impact that they have for you guys, which is the really exciting part, which is why I personally love matching gifts. I'm a volunteer grants. Typically, when we think about how, I would say like the average nonprofit is handling matching gifts and volunteer grants, it's more in what we call like a reactive way, meaning people are going to give and volunteer. And then every now and then you might get an email in your inbox saying, hey, John Smith works for Coke and he wants to get your gift matched. And you're like, oh, that's surprising. That's great. What a good extra $50 we could use this year. And then you just kind of keep it moving from there. That's what we consider to be a little bit more reactive, in that, someone makes a gift, someone volunteers. There's not really any prompts for matching gifts during that process. You're not finding out where donors work. You're not allowing them to really know if they're eligible. After they participate in volunteer gifts, they're going to get some type of thank you messaging. And rarely are you guys incorporating matching gifts or volunteer grants into that thank you messaging. There's little to no mention of matching gifts or volunteer grants at events, which equals about 5% or less of donors actually submitting, which is how you guys end up getting 1% to 2% of what you could get into door. Typically, when we think about matching gifts specifically of your individual gifts that you're getting, it's really 5% to 15% of those are eligible for corporate matching, but you're really only getting 1% to 2%. And that's why all that revenue is left on the table, and that right now matching gifts and volunteer grants is seen as free money, which it is. But, nothing's really free, or at least that's what my granddad used to tell me. You have to put a little elbow grease in everything, to tap into that 4 to 7 billion. Typically, when we think about what prevents the average nonprofit from being able to dedicate tons of time to matching gifts and volunteer grants, or rather what allows tons of that revenue to be left on the table, it boils down to you as a nonprofit probably having some type of difficulty, maybe from a bandwidth standpoint, and knowing where all of your donors work, right? Because the larger you get, it's unreasonable to assume you're going to know where every single donor works. Donors and volunteers aren't going to know they're eligible. We've talked about that already. They don't know how to submit. You guys don't have a great way to follow up. Maybe it's from a bandwidth perspective, or being able to leverage certain tools perspective. And then overall, as a nonprofit, you may not have great insight into where they are in that matching gift process. And all of these kind of common pain points are directly related to that, what we call that reactive approach. To where, folks are giving, it's seen as free money, matching gifts and volunteer grants. And then, next year you put tons of time into fundraising again without taking the moment to consider where matching gifts and volunteer grants actually come in. So the really cool thing about, the different types of ways you can actually support and fundraise through corporate matching gifts and volunteer grants is that you guys have already put tons of elbow grease into your donor and volunteer journey. You guys are already communicating with your donors throughout the year. You're already trying to get buy-in into your mission and your causes. You're already getting that buy-in. You're already sending follow-up messages. You're already stewarding donors. So why not take some time to strategically think about how you don't have to reinvent the wheel? You can just add matching gift and volunteer grant marketing into the wheel that already exists. And that is the beauty of corporate philanthropy and matching gifts and volunteer grants. And that there are some real pain points to being able to drive in that additional matching gift and volunteer grant revenue. But they aren't things that can't be overcome by simply leveraging what you've already put hard work into create at your organization. So I like, imagine the donor journey or volunteer journey is like a loop, as you can see. this loop has been very oversimplified, I'm sure you guys know, but it really breaks down, you know, the journey into a few different pieces to where you're cultivating folks, you're getting the buy-in from people, you're converting them into donors or volunteers, getting them to believe and buy in into the nonprofit's mission. You know, ideally, once someone gives to you, you're stewarding them so they continue to believe in the work that you're doing. And so they continue to give and you're retaining them as donors, right? So pretty simple, you know, cultivation, conversion, stewardship, and retention. At the average nonprofit, there are different things that you guys are likely already doing in each phase of this donor journey. That you're being very proactive and making sure that donors who are giving for the first time are going to give again, or at least have a higher likelihood of giving again. And the goal is for you guys to take that same proactivity to kind of plug and play different ideas around corporate and volunteer grants into that journey that already exists. So a couple ideas that are just really good ones and really easy ones to follow. And there's images of these and examples listed in our Ultimate Guide to Matching Gifts as well. Is in the theme of increasing visibility and cultivating donors. Thinking about where on your websites and where in very early interactions with folks can you mention matching gifts. So there's tons of examples here, you know, navigation bar, having dedicated matching gift and volunteer grant pages that the only sole purpose of that page is to provide insight into those processes. If you're already paying for ads or you're doing fundraising appeals or sending out email blasts to people who visit your website, why not incorporate some matching gift language into those newsletters and mentioning matching gifts and volunteer grants on your donation registration pages. All of those different ways right now you're trying to communicate and get buy-in for donors. Thinking about where can you loop matching gifts into that. You know, we've done some surveys and we've done some stats over the course of our, you know, our time in existence, and 84% of folks we've surveyed at one point indicated that they're more likely to donate if a match is offered. And that sounds great, but the tricky thing is making sure they know that a match is actually offered to leverage that opportunity to get them to actually donate. Mentioning matching gifts specifically and fundraising appeals, we've seen has resulted in a 71% increase in response rate, meaning that, you know, if you're mentioning matching gifts coupled with the idea that someone can get gift, those donors are more likely to actually get involved and donate. And even with some of our partners, when we think about how we've integrated our matching gift tools into their platforms, we have cool little upsell features that allows you to say, hey donor, you're giving $20, you can get your gift matched if you give 25. And those little upsell asks that you can even roll out yourself have resulted in a 51% increase in donation amounts. So thinking about as you're cultivating donors, as you're doing all you can do to get that buy-in into your mission, matching gifts and volunteer grants really begins at the same place of where you're saying, we want you to support us. We're important. Our mission is important. You're important to our mission. And how cool it would be if you support us and then leverage volunteer matching grants on top of that. I'm really big on, you could probably tell on like this idea of cultivation of donors and getting people to buy in, because if you've already done the hard work to create like an amazing digital experience for your donors, you know, you visit websites, there's pop-ups of videos where you guys are doing direct response. There's, you know, there's videos from people providing testimonies of how your services have impacted them. You've done such a good job to make sure people are, you know, captured by what you're trying to do, making sure that you're taking the opportunity to incorporate matching gifts and volunteer grants into that communication is important as well. So it could be a video of someone talking about volunteerism and how their company matched. It could be, like I said, you know, highlighting matching gifts in newsletters. Tons of different examples there. Moving on to conversion, right? Now talking about, you know, once the buy-in is there, the work really doesn't stop. The show doesn't stop at that point. Because I want you guys to think about how much emphasis you put on what's next. Like, how often are you guys asking yourself what's next when you push out big fundraising appeals or you roll out a new event for the first time. Hopefully it's pretty often that you guys are planning for how you are going to make sure all of that hard work you put into that event or that fundraising appeal is not for nothing, and then that payoff rolls over. So, I always like to pose the question, do any of you guys just let someone give online for the first time, or does anyone let someone mail in a check and they never hear from you again, or you don't send a thank you email or at least thank you receipt? The answer is probably no. The answer is probably hopefully no, that you guys have a way to make sure that you are picking up on people who are supporting you guys, and the conversation does not end there. So the same way that, that donation conversation doesn't end, matching gifts and volunteer grants should not end when the buy-in is initiated. Because I know it's hard because there may not be anyone at your team who is dedicated to specifically matching gifts or volunteer grants, but there are people who are dedicated to making sure that thank you email looks superb. There are people who are dedicated to making sure that your thank you receipt or your thank you page that donors get after they give has really important information and creates a good experience and creates a good thank you. There's people who are dedicated to making sure there are email reminders going out to get people's buy-in. So in theme of thinking about where you can incorporate matching gifts, after someone gives to you guys, having the opportunity to share matching gift information on that thank you page is one of the most important places that you can mention volunteer grants if someone's registered for an event, or matching gifts if someone's donated, because it's at the point someone has given you concrete proof that they've given you buy-in. They still have that warm and fuzzy feeling that I like to call it. And now you can take an immediate next step and say, hey, matching gifts and volunteer grants are actually a part of our donation and in our philanthropy culture. So you can't do one without the other. And that's really important, because the same way that, thanking donors encourages them to give again, by up over 50%, if you thank someone, they're more likely to give again in the future. Encouraging someone to take the next immediate step from a matching gift or volunteer grant experience does the exact same thing, and that you're catching them in that window where they're still super heightened based on what you guys are providing in mission-based services, and they will take that next step for you guys. So the big thing here is, when the show doesn't stop for you all after someone gives or after someone volunteers, what are you doing? Think about what you're doing to kind of keep those people engaged, and think about where matching gifts can fit into that. It could be your thank you email. It could be your thank you page where you're mentioning matching gifts or volunteer grants after someone's registered. It could be rolling out company-specific matching gift pushes, saying, hey, we think you work for a matching company, or we heard you work for Home Depot. They offer a match. Here's the matching gift information. And one thing that nonprofits really forget a lot of times is how important donor call centers or like telephones can be to that experience as well. And that if you already have literally a whole team of people dedicated to calling and asking for buy-in or thanking people for buy-in, rolling out some type of matching gift or volunteer ask as a part of those scripts as well, saying, hey, we're calling you, Miss Brenda, because you volunteered with us last year, and we really need volunteers in response to the recent natural disaster. We were seeing if you can come out and volunteer. And if the answer is yes, we also wanted to inquire about where you work, because your company might actually match those volunteer hours as well. So super simple, and just thinking in ways you can incorporate those asks for matching gifts and volunteer grants. Moving on to retention, once someone's gotten buy-in, once they've shown they're going to support you guys, and hopefully you're doing a good job of of communicating matching gifts and volunteer grants to those folks after they've supported you all, you really want to think about stewardship as it relates to volunteer grants and matching gifts, just as importantly as you think about stewardship for just a general donation. When I think about the biggest area of improvement that we often see for nonprofits, when they're saying, someone submitted a match 5 years ago, but we haven't heard from them since, sometimes it's because they weren't thanked. And, because they weren't thanked, they weren't reminded of how valuable them taking 5 minutes to submit that match request was. And so when I think of stewardship and retention specifically for matching gifts and volunteer grants, it really boils down to recognition. And sometimes recognition can be a hard ask, for a nonprofit, or you could take a little bit more elbow grease than you used to put that in. But the same way, you know, donors are 400% more likely to give again if they're just simply thanked, and like thanked through public recognition, or thanked through end of the year letters. Same thing for volunteer grants and matching gifts. So if you're a peer-to-peer nonprofit, you may see some of the larger nonprofits in the country start following the model of where they have thermometers or fundraising goals that are being widely shared as they're doing a big push, or as individuals are getting their coworkers and family and friends to support. Some of those nonprofits are allowing matching gifts to be represented in those fundraising goals, which I think it's really pivotal depending on the nonprofit. And that if someone's really pumped to hit $500 for a goal they've set for you guys, and then they know matching gifts can count towards that goal, I best believe they're going to be checking in to see if their friends and their families are submitting those matching gift request forms, the same way they're encouraging folks to get involved in this first time. Another really cool idea is an annual day of matching, or annual day of volunteering, in the sense that you guys likely already have a day of giving, right? It could be Giving Tuesday, it could be an additional day. You do tons of marketing for your day of giving. And then after people give, you're probably saying thank you. You're sharing about how well you guys did and how close you got to your goal. That is the absolute perfect time to couple that with a day of matching or a day of volunteerism, saying this is where we landed and this is how much more we can get if you guys take a moment to see if you're eligible. Phone-a-thon, day of thanks, pretty self-explanatory. You know, calling folks instead of asking for money, simply saying thank you and have you checked with your volunteer or your matching gift process. End of the year reminders, acknowledgements, rolling out matching gift or volunteer clubs, similar that you might have for your own giving. So you might have like a president's club or a higher donor club, being able to create some type of recognition or prestige around this idea of who is getting the most dollars matched or the most volunteer hours matched. You know, recognizing your top matching donors and top volunteer grant donors at awards or events is just as important. And then highlighting your goals as it pertains to matching gifts and volunteer grants in those annual reports you sent out. Those are just a few ideas. But again, the idea is being able for you guys to just find areas that you are already mentioning or thanking donors about giving and goals to loop in matching gifts as well. Going up, I just want to see if there's some questions. Yeah, it looks like someone really likes the annual day of matching. That's one of my favorites too. Rarely anyone does it, but like I said, if you're already putting in all the hard work for those days of giving, a day of matching is just the perfect way to couple it. And it's so easy, I promise, if you have access to like a matching gift database or done a good job of keeping track of where your donors work and who's eligible that way. There's tons of other ideas I'm sure you guys could think of when you're thinking about what you're already doing and how you can loop in volunteer grants and matching gifts into that. Wanted to share a couple, quick stats for you just to kind of take away, maybe if you want to go back to your team and say, hey, I attended this webinar and I have some ideas. Here's some quick stats that I think are impactful for us. If you're marketing and you're given the opportunity to share the word about volunteer grants and matching gifts with your donors, we've seen up to 50% more of your eligible folks are going to submit. And to me, it's just basic math, right? I'm from the South. I'm from Georgia. So we say closed mouths don't get fed. It's the same thing. If you're not asking, it's not going to come in. But if you are asking, you're going to see those percentages go up naturally. Asking also helps you increase, the average amount of revenue that you're capturing. When we think about that 5 to 15% of your donors who are match eligible, and maybe closer to like a 5 to 10% of donors who may be volunteer grant eligible, the average nonprofit's only really capturing about 1.3% of that. So asking is naturally going to increase that percentage. And as a result, you're going to generate what we see on average, there's 20 to 50% more of that revenue year over year, meaning as you continue to ask, the big thing is as you're asking over time, volunteer grants becomes a part of your volunteer culture, and matching gifts becomes a part of your donation culture. So what that means is you're going to get your new folks supporting you guys through matching gifts and volunteer grants. Your returning folks supporting you guys through matching gifts and volunteer grants. So naturally, as your donor base grows, your matching gifts and volunteer grants will grow as well. And research shows that someone who submits a matching gift once to your nonprofit, who is properly stewardship to or stewarded to, is more likely, 3 times more likely actually, to inquire about corporate matching gifts or corporate volunteer grants, even when they switch jobs. Meaning, I could work at Home Depot today, go work for Coca-Cola in 6 months, but because you've thanked me, I'm more likely to actually inquire about matching gift programs at future jobs, which is really important as well. I see some questions. Really quickly, I just want to show you a couple resources that are in these slides. Happy to figure out a way to get these slides to you guys as well. But here's just an actionable nonprofit checklist, just some simple questions I typically ask nonprofits who are kind of new to the matching gift and volunteer grant world. Basically, when you're thinking about some easy ways you can incorporate what we've kind of talked about briefly into what you're already doing, it's just a quick checklist to say, like, I'm just even curious about how easy we make it for donors to find volunteer grants and matching gifts. What happens if I Google my org's name and matching gifts? What comes up, right? Taking a look at your thank you email, because it might have been a long time since you looked at it, to see where you mentioned matching gifts. Just some quick exercises you could do to really be able to gauge where you are and room for improvement and opportunity to further spread matching gifts to your donors. Like I said, we can get these slides to you if needed. And then just 11 most valuable matching gift best practices as well. Just some recommendations that we have. But in the last couple minutes, I want to take a look. I think there's 1 or 2 questions that I want to check out. There's one question that says, if you receive a matching gift from an employee of $100 and the company matches it by $100, do you classify the gift $100 from an individual and $100 from the corporation? So it really depends on the nature of your nonprofit, but typically what we see the largest nonprofits do is the initial gift that was given by the donor, in this case the $100, is accredited to the donor. Then there is some type of soft or hard promise that's created within like your CRM that represents you received $100 from Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola in your CRM, that $100 is kind of mapped to that Coca-Cola record. But most nonprofits are creating some type of promise, we call it a promise, that allows you to easily see that while that $100 is being accredited to Coca-Cola because they gave that $100 match, that this donor, John, who gave $100, has a kind of like a soft credit or a hard credit represented, that they're the reason that $100 came in. So that's typically how it's done. I know, it's kind of a loaded statement depending on how your internal CRM is built, right, and how you decided to represent those matching gifts. But typically at the end of the year, you want to have a way to see what John gave you and what Coca-Cola gave you. And so you want those gifts to be properly credited to both those sources, but there is some type of tie-in in the middle that the average nonprofit we work with creates that allows you to be able to really quickly also see that John's responsible for $100 of that match. Hope that was a helpful answer for you. Happy to, provide any follow-up answers as well. And if there's any last minute questions, feel free to just post them in the chat. And like I said, take a look at that Ultimate Guide to Matching Gifts. Has tons of examples of some of the stuff we talked about. Take a look at the dip jar brochure, and just always feel free to reach out to Double the Donation with questions. You can always visit our website. We have webinars, and you can reach out to us at support@doublethedonation.com with any questions you have about our services or any tips you need.
Thank you so much, Sydney Faye. That was awesome. For everyone who attended, we really appreciate you taking the time on this Tuesday afternoon to listen in. We will be sending out the slides and kind of like a recap of the webinar to everybody who attended. So if you think you missed anything or want to share some of the information with the rest of your team, we'll definitely make that possible for you. And Sydney Faye and I are also open if you guys have any other questions, either right now or in the future. You guys can definitely contact us. I'll make sure that our contact information is in the information that we send out later today as a follow-up. But other than that, yeah, thank you guys so much. And we look forward to checking in with you soon and hope you can make some actionable items from today.